Hi, and welcome to Chapter 13 on Managing Human Resources Globally. This is a chapter that I think is going to be very interesting to many of you. First and foremost, because you're taking this class, Global Business, and many of you are pursuing the certificate and the degree in Global Business. You are obviously very keenly interested in pursuing a career in that area. And so this is an important chapter for you personally because it'll help you have leverage in terms of optimizing or improving your chances of working in that field, in that area as an employee. All right, let's get right to it with the learning outcomes. The first thing we'll look at is staffing decisions with focus on expatriates or expats. We'll look at the definitions in just a second. Then, of course, training and development needs for expats. So yes, it is human resources. For those of you who already took management, intro to management, we covered the chapter on human resources there. So you'll see some similarities, but obviously within the context of the global environment. Identify and discuss compensation and performance appraisal issues. This is a really interesting chapter as well here. A part of the chapter as we look at compensation, not just the challenge of compensating employees and dealing with cost of living adjustments from country to country. And remember, the law of one price, purchasing power parity, the PPP, and all these other things to consider. But also the premium that you would have to pay for someone to just, uproot their entire family to move to another place where the kids go to, a different school, learn a new language, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's going to be an important part of looking at compensation. Then, of course, labor relations. We'll look at the factors that affect that in both home and host countries. The rules are different throughout the world, and obviously, it'll affect multinationals. How institution-based and resource-based views shed additional light on human resource management. Again, it's the theme of the book. We always look at both views. And we'll end the chapter with the 5 C's of HRM. All right, let's get right to it. The definitions of HRM, human resource management. And so it's an activity that attracts, select, and manage employees. Those are the activities defined for HRM. It's a strategic function that helps accomplish organizational goals and financial performance. Now, that might not seem like a big deal when you look at these definitions and you look at especially strategic function, but it really is. And if you think about the history of management, and for those of you who remember, for those of you who took intro to management, and remember all of the pioneers in management, Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, all these people. You remember that once upon a time, human resources was just about people and just people as a resource, the same way that companies viewed natural resources almost. I need metal to make a car. I can change suppliers. I need someone to put the car together, and people are disposable. It wasn't up until fairly recently in that timeline that managers and academics and researchers and corporations really started to better understand the significance of human resources from a strategic perspective. You do all this planning, you do all this work, you develop mission statements, vision statements, and hope to be very competitive. But if you don't hire the right people, if you don't develop the right people, if you don't hire leaders and enable them to grow as leaders within the company, then all of that effort is for naught. So that's when you think about strategic aspect and the strategic functions of HRM, that's what that entails. All right, staffing HRM activities associated with hiring employees and filling positions. We look at the types of employees. So here, you have a multinational and they're operating in other continents. You start, with the Asian continent, Latin American continent, European continent, and then the question becomes, what should we do in terms of managers, in terms of employees? Should we hire managers from that country where we're going, the host country, or should we send our own people from the parent company? If let's say it's an American multinational, we are going to send an army of executives to just take over these markets and be leaders in these markets. Or maybe, third option, maybe none of the above. Maybe they're not American executives. Let's say if this is going to Spain, and maybe they're not Spanish executives. Maybe I'm going to really cast a wide web, and I have an executive from India who is extremely well qualified, fantastic education, exceeds all the criteria. That's who I'm going to hire. So maybe it's a third country national. So types of employees, let's get to it. Host country national is someone from the host country who works for a multinational enterprise. So in the example that I gave you just now, if we had a multinational set up in Barcelona, Spain, then it would be an executive from there, someone who maybe worked their way up. That's who you would hire or who you would promote. And then expats. Let's look at expats. So again, an expatriate is a non-native employee working in a foreign country. So if I sent a student, I'm sorry, let's use a student as an example. Let's call him Ariel, and let's say that he gets the job, and here he gets promoted in this multinational company that develops video games, and now we have a division set up in Barcelona, and we're going to send him with his family, his wife and his 5 children, and we're going to send them to Barcelona. We got to pay for the kids' education. His wife is going to be compensated for having to uproot. So that would be an example of an expatriate, and we'll talk more about that. There are different types of expats. So you have the parent country national expat. The example of Ariel I just gave you would be that. Employee who comes from the parent country of the multinational and works at its local subsidiary. Example I gave you is Barcelona. Or the third country national, that employee from India. Employee who comes from neither the parent country nor the host country of the MNE. Again, 7.5 billion people on this planet. What does it say when you tell your stakeholders that you can't find anyone good for a position outside of the 330 million Americans that you're tapping into? And of course, culture does count, but it's smart to just cast a wide web and hire talent for talent's sake. So let's look now at the parent country, third country, and host country national advantages and disadvantages. There's pros and cons for each. So the parent country national, the PCNs, again, example I used was Ariel, American executive, being sent to Spain, Barcelona. What's good about that is that the control by headquarters is facilitated. He's sent by the company he was hired with. He understands the corporate culture. He understands vision, mission, etc. better than anybody, and so that's a huge plus. He may be the most qualified person. There's nobody else, and he would gain international experience if we sent him to Spain, which would be great for us because coming back, he could help us develop, better games for that market, etc. What's bad about that is that the opportunities are limited for the host country nationals, right? So again, in this case, what you're doing is you have some great people at that division in Barcelona who are, Spaniards and who have climbed up the ladder, and now they hit this ceiling because they're not getting promoted because you keep sending American executives there. So you're blocking their opportunities. The parent company's national adaptation may take a long time. Ariel is rusty on Spanish, and culturally he hasn't gone out, and he's from New York. And so this is going to be a big culture shock, and it may take him and his wife a while, and the kids. And of course, very expensive. We talked about that. Now let's look at the third country national. So that's the example. Now we have the same company. We call it Taurus Gaming Industries. Let's call it this big multinational. And Ariel was the example we used for the PCN. But in this case, what we're going to do a little bit differently is we're going to say that this gaming giant is not sending an American executive to Spain, and they're not promoting a Spaniard for the position, but they have hired someone from Mumbai, India, for the job, right? And so in this example may bridge the gap between headquarters and the subsidiary, and may be less expensive. However, host governments and employees may resent that person, and similar to disadvantages for parent country nationals for the other stuff, right? And then of course the host country national. So now we have a local. We have this executive who's done a great job. We'll call her Sira. And so Sira has climbed up the ladder. She's very competent, very smart. And in this case, because we're promoting her in charge of that division, the language and the cultural barriers are eliminated. There's better continuity of management and cheaper. Again, cheaper than having to send a parent company national for sure, right? Now, what's bad is the control and coordination by headquarters may be impeded. Again, in this case, the way of doing business, there are things culturally that might not be completely congruent or aligned with headquarters or how they do business or how they would like to do business. The host country nationals may have limited career opportunity. Maybe that's it. They're going to stay there. They're going to stay in that market, but they're not bringing them back to the U.S. at headquarters. And the international experience might also be limited. All right, let's look at the approaches for staffing. So we have several approaches. Let's start with the first one, ethnocentric. Now, ethnocentric, we talked about that word before in very negative connotation, which it is. It's a word that's extremely charged, right? This is not how we're going to apply that word now. We're just using it as a descriptor. In this case, the descriptor is to emphasize norms and practices of the parent company, to rely on parent company nationals, and necessitated perhaps by a seeming lack of talent in the host country. So that would be the ethnocentric approach. As you've read in this book, Japan, since Japan really started expanding in the 80s compared to other multinationals in other countries, let's say Western Europe or North America, Japan was late in the game in internationalizing that way. And so Japan relied very heavily on its parent company approach as it really has decided to take over. Let's see, polycentric. Norms and practices of the host country relies on host country nationals. Host country nationals have no language or cultural barriers and can increase the morale of other host country nationals if placed on top. So that would be the example of the polycentric approach. And then, of course, the geocentric approach. Think about our Indian executive. We'll call her Lakshmi. And so in this case, focus on finding the most suitable managers, creates corporate-wide culture, and identify for geographically dispersed M&Es. And so those are the approaches, right? And again, they're often going to mirror the strategy of the company. And maybe, depending on the how big of an ability the company has to really convey its objective with the corporate culture, this is going to really help determine what's the best course of action. All right, so what are the MNC strategies and staffing approaches? Again, we have them here. Home replication. Remember, we did this in the last chapter. Home replication, localization, global standardization, transnational. And now we can connect the dots for each and the local, typical top managers for each, right? So you might have to go back to that chapter and find that grid, that matrix, and make sure that this makes sense and you're able to plot accordingly. What are the roles of expats? Okay, so expats have several roles. Number one is strategy. They're strategists. They represent the interest of the multinational's headquarters. That's number one. And so, the point of this for-profit company is obviously just that. And so this group of people, these expats, have to ensure that maybe strategically and then even tactically, they're able to align to the objective of the company, namely its overarching strategic plan. The daily managers, they run operations and build local capabilities. So a little bit of operations there. Of course, they're ambassadors, right? Represent headquarters' interest and build relationships with host country stakeholders. Represent the interest of the subsidiaries to headquarters. Whenever you see a picture of a CEO or in this case, well, it wouldn't be a CEO, it would be an executive cutting a ribbon with some local person. It could be, I don't know, a governor or a mayor or somebody. That would be that example, that they're an ambassador for their multinational as they show the image, right, of the company. There's this book that I really like called Driving Honda, which is the history of Honda and how Honda became Honda. And when Honda opened its first plant in the U.S., Soichiro Honda at the time was involved in cutting the ribbon, the whole thing. And there was a Honda power tool, I can't remember what it was, but something that was part of the ceremony that he was going to use to dig or something, but it didn't work. And instead of being, just embarrassed, he decided that he was going to try to find another solution, work his way around, try to fix it. And so it was great because the way that maybe culturally that would have been seen by many with the corporate culture that he had of problem solving at Honda made it just such a great opportunity to display how the company operates. Let's see. And of course, trainers to train local employees. So these are the 4 roles of the expats. Make sure you get those out of the way. Let's see. Okay, so now that we've done this, and by the way, I'm following the book as I do this. So now we're on page 207. And let's move on to the role of expats here as applied. So remember that these roles are roles that are going to be where that manager is going to have to go back and forth between the headquarters and the parent company and the subsidiary. They're the go-between, and those roles help them accomplish the objectives of the MNE in that host country. Now, things are not super rosy when you consider effectiveness, let's call it, of expats. Expat failure is, been documented as pretty high, actually. And so it's first, how do you measure it? Well, it's when you send someone overseas and they're supposed to be there for 5-6 years and they come back after 1 or 2 years. So that's a measure of failure, premature return. Maybe they just they never did what they were supposed to in the first place. Unfulfilled business objectives could be another one. And then also the career development objectives could be another failure. And this is where the book does a really good job in walking you through what happens to these expats when they come back home. And how they a lot of times hit a brick wall in terms of career development objectives when they get back. And so cause for failures can be many. Family's inability to adjust to life in a foreign country. Your author on page 208 walks us through with several things about expats, right? They're expensive and failure rates are high in general, but middle-aged expats, 40-something, are the most expensive. It kind of makes sense because that's the age group there that often associated with, younger children, et cetera, et cetera. And so what a lot of companies have realized is that they might be better off either going up and sending an expat in their 50s, or better yet, younger expats, right? So here what we learned from your author is that younger expats typically do not need a large home or education allowance. And given the importance of international experience, many younger managers are eager to go overseas. So this development has strong implication for students studying this book, right? Overseas opportunities may come sooner than you expect. And so again, just tying this chapter to the class and tying the class to the degree, to your objective, and of course, tying the whole thing to you, your personal goals. Let's see, and combination of work-related and family-related problems are also cause for failure. So again, what are the factors for selection, right? There's the situation that's going to have three factors and the individual themselves. So let's start with the situation. First, there's going to be the preference for the MNC. What are they looking for? Then there's the host country preference and, of course, language. Just about the worst thing you could do is to send someone on an assignment like that who has not mastered the language. And then for the individual person, their technical ability and expertise. What are the cross-cultural adaptability? And what are the spouse and family preference? As you can see, there's just a lot to take into consideration. In fact, your author has a great closing case on page 217 about an executive having to make that decision between working in Chicago, Illinois, or Shanghai, China. It's a great little way of looking at the process. Okay, training and development. The training, a specific preparation to do a particular job. The development, longer term than training, broader preparation to improve managerial skills for a better career. Back in the early 2000, I know I sound like a dinosaur every time I start like that, when I attended this university in Mexico, Universidad Internacional in Cuernavaca. And when I studied there, I was there for 2 months, and it was a great program. It's called Spanish for the Professionals. But what was fascinating is the mix of classmates that I had, in there next to me. And so one of the classes, well, I took several classes, but one of the classes was called Éxito Comercial. And, a little bit of everything. Basically, it was kind of a just hodgepodge intro to business type class for, how to apply business to the Mexican market to help someone who even speaks Spanish fluently learn key terms, financial terms, banking terms, etc., but also understand how to do business in Mexico. What was fascinating was to see how many executives were sent there from their company. I remember being with a lot of actually auto executives. General Motors had numerous, Ford Motor Company. I just had missed her, but a week before I got there, at the time it was, I believe, one of the VPs of Ford Motor Company that had been there for 2 weeks. And these are crash courses in really learning about business, the culture, how to do business, how to motivate people, how to demotivate people, to avoid all that thing. So again, it was interesting to see how long some of these people were there. And I remember this one guy from HSBC, which is a huge bank. He was a Swiss gentleman, and he was there for a whole month. And he, just to make sure that he absolutely immersed himself in the culture prior to working at some local bank. Very important. And so training for expats, the training length and the rigor must correspond to the estimated length of stay. For short stay, survival level language training is imperative, where's the bathroom type of stuff, nice to meet you, whatever. But longer stay, of course, more extensive language and sensitivity training in an immersion program should be provided. Going back to my time at Universidad Internacional, we called it UNINTER for short. And they still have that program, I believe, in Cuernavaca. But what was fascinating was how the executives that were going to spend more time working in Mexico were not only sent there because of the education, but more importantly, because you were placed with a family. And the family that was chosen by the university that participated in the program had to have several requirements, but at the very, very top of all the requirements for how the university selected a family, the preference or the requirement, I should say, was to pick families that only spoke Spanish. So that, if you are there to learn Spanish, you cannot rely on someone in the household where you're staying for a month or more, in my case 2 months, speaks zero English, zero French, zero German, or any other language. And that's one of the reasons they were selected. And that, is great because that immersion really helped everybody, sink or swim. Okay, repatriate. Now that, you had this executive work overseas for you, you're bringing them back. And there's all kinds of considerations. I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of culture shock. I didn't see it featured here, but I know in some other books in the past, I had seen some authors address something called reverse culture shock, right? When you go to another country and you experience culture shock, well, when you've lived overseas for long enough and you come back to your country of origin, you can experience what's called a reverse culture shock, that there are things that you had forgotten and now you have to readjust. And so there's all kinds of consequences to consider. A manager who returns to his or her home country after working in other countries, a repatriate, or you're repatriating them. What are the problems faced? Career anxiety is the first one. In this case, there's something called a psychological contract, right? Which is an informal emphasis on informal understanding of expected delivery of benefits in the future for current services. So your boss sends you overseas and says, look, if you do this for us and you're able to develop this market, and when you come back, you can run this entire division over here. And then, of course, you come back and the person who made you that promise has been replaced by somebody else, or maybe it's still the same person, but, they forgot or they're just not honoring it. And now you're realizing it's going to be actually harder for you to move up. There's a loss of status. You've been gone and things have happened. There's cultural readjustment. So this is where you can refer back to this notion of reverse culture shock. Family may face difficulties in adjusting as well. In the textbook, our author talks about even the kids, coming back and maybe, trends change, fashion change. And, for younger adults, this can be pretty important and devastating. In fact, your author points out to cases in Japan where some of the children of executives in Japan, it's right here from your book on page 209, having been brought up overseas, readjusting back to the home country educational system may be especially problematic. Some returning Japanese teenagers have committed suicide after failing to make the grade back home. That's just catastrophic. It's tragic. And so again, the consequences can be really dire. Career development planning helps reduce expat turnover. Training and development for host country nationals. So again, this is for these managers, local managers. Since I used the example of Barcelona, Spain earlier, let's go with that. this is someone who works in that division, requires significant attention. In China, retaining or losing talent depends on the employers offering good training and development opportunities. Your author goes on to tell us about executives in China getting bombarded with offers from headhunters to travel all over the place. In order to slow down turnover, MNEs offer formal career development plans and processes for the host country nationals. Now, how do you pay these people, right? How do you compensate them? So let's look at salaries and benefits. Those are the ways that you're going to compensate them. And there's also performance appraisal, evaluation of employee performance for promotion, retention, or ending employment. That sounds pretty straightforward. That sounds easy enough, right? It is so complex. It's so complex because what happens when you are evaluating a host country national and you yourself are a parent country national, right? So your way of evaluating your standards are going to have to be adapted to the host country or else. And so it can really be very, very challenging as we learn. So compensation for expats, there's the going rate approach, pays expat the prevailing going rate for comparable position in a host country. Fosters equality among PCNs, TCNs, and HCNs within the same subsidiary. Everybody's on par, right? Then there's the balance sheet approach, which now you're looking at cost of living differences based on parent country levels. As we all know, and as we've learned in this class, again, going back to the purchasing power parity idea, law of one price, basket of good exchange rate, all that stuff, we've learned that, yes, you can't just convert a currency to another to see what the true cost is. There are other factors to consider when looking at cost of living. This adds a financial inducement to make the package attractive, right? So what I did here is this just came out a couple weeks ago, actually. This is from the Economist magazine, Economist Intelligence Unit of the Economist. And every year they have this worldwide cost of living where they track costs throughout the world. And so I wanted to share this with you. It's a small clip, and it's going to walk you through in terms of what has changed in the world when it comes to cost. I hope you found that interesting. And so let's look at the pros and cons for the going rate versus the balance sheet. So you could see that for the going rate, the first one we had discussed, the parity, right? The equality among parent country, third country, host country nationals, the same location is a plus. It's simple, and identification with host country is another plus. What's bad is variations between assignments in different locations for the same employees, and a re-entry problem if the going rate in the parent country is less than in the host country. So coming back home is a problem. For the balance sheet, there's equity between assignments of the same employee, and it facilitates expat reentry when they come back. Again, think about cost of living adjustments. It's costly and complex to administer, and there's great disparities between expats and host country nationals. So looking at compensations for host country nationals, again, this is using the Spain example. This is for the manager in Barcelona, let's say. So low-level HCNs have low bargaining power. Does that make sense? This is a person who's from Spain, who's in Barcelona, and there's really not a lot they can do about the cost of their assignment, since the company is having their division there. Host country nationals in management and professional positions have more bargaining powers than they do at low level. And most MNEs plan to eventually replace top-level expats with host country nationals, in part to save cost. I hope that makes sense. So Ariel, remember him? We sent him earlier. We said we're going to send him to Spain. And we did that. We sent him to Barcelona, and he had, let's say, a 6-year assignment. And he really built this great unit, and he's done amazing, and everything's fine. After 6 years, we're going to bring him back. So we're saving a lot of money now. But instead of sending another, parent country national, a PCN, now what we're going to do is hire some local person. MNEs unwilling to pay top dollar for local talent may end up losing high caliber host country nationals to competitors, and that's why in management professional positions have more bargaining power, because of competition and the free market. I want to just kind of throw in for you right there that again, if you don't use, if you haven't already created an account on LinkedIn, you need to. You need to create an account. You need to make sure it's current. You need to make sure that you keep it current. One of the really interesting things about LinkedIn, what they've done, and there's no other company like it. I believe now they're twice. Just think about over twice the entire population of the United States is the amount of people who subscribe to LinkedIn, and it's free. And so what happens with LinkedIn is, using data, they've been able to actually let you know if your job, your career, based on what your salary is, if you're on par to your peers in the same sector, or getting paid less or more. And so that's a great tool to have. But because of things like that, it makes it a little bit more difficult for companies to not be equitable. The performance appraisal helps managers make decisions about pay and promotion, development, documentation, and subordinate expression. Cultural differences can create problems when appraising host country nationals. We talked about that earlier. Expats should be evaluated by their own supervisors. So again, supervisors may be based at headquarters and often evaluate them based on hard numbers. And that's, again, we talked about that earlier, to make sure that, cultural, the paradigm of culture doesn't interfere with the evaluation. Compensation and performance appraisal plays an important role during an economic crisis, such as what we have going on now. Then we're getting into the next section here, which is labor relations. Unions in the United States, I mean, what we've learned here, I know you've learned that in other classes as well, Intro to Business, Management. Unionization in the U.S. has gone down over the years, right? In the U.S., unions membership dropped from 20% of the workforce in 1983 to 11% now, and just 7% in the private sectors and 36% in the public sectors. So we learned that membership in the UAW, for example, fell from 1.5 million to less than 400,000 at present. So what we're learning is, in the United States, unions are becoming less and less popular, right? And so what's happening is this: when you have an MNE that has an international footprint, a decision needs to be made about what that means for labor relations. And think about also since we've talked about in this class, foreign direct investment. We love FDI, don't we? Inward FDI. We love the fact that these foreign multinationals are spending millions and millions, billions even at times of dollars by building factories, etc. in the United States. And so what do you think? As much as we of course you want the best for workers, etc. But Honda, Toyota, Mercedes-Benz, when they decided where to set up shop, when they decided where they're going to have factories in the United States, well, again, the unintended consequence here about strong unionization in the Midwest is that Japanese and German automakers came to the U.S. They avoided the Midwest because of, it is a union stronghold, and instead they went to the rural South and set up non-union plants in small towns in Alabama, where Mercedes and Hyundai are situated, Kentucky for Toyota, and South Carolina for BMW. Exclusively, this was not just because of tax incentives from the governors of those states. It was exclusively so that they wouldn't have to deal with unions. And so some consideration here. In home country, the firm's main concern is cutting cost and enhancing competitiveness, and the union's concern is increasing wage and benefits. But what about abroad? Well, MNEs prefer to deal with non-unionized labor. Governments in many developing nations welcome MNEs and simultaneously silence union. That happens in Mexico, where when the AFL-CIO back in the 90s contacted the Mexican government, requested permission to recruit members in Mexico, and that request was flatly rejected. High-profile strikes at plants run by Foxconn, Japan's Honda, and China forced MNEs to accept pay increase, signals some change there. The author in the book on page 213 has an example here about Hewlett-Packard in France. So in Western Europe, France has always had very, very, very entrenched, strong unions. And so it's what does that mean? Well, let's look again from page 213. Legal hurdles for firing full-time workers in France are legendary. When Hewlett-Packard announced a plan to lay off 1,200 employees in France, then President Jacques Chirac called HP directly and complained. Doesn't that sound like a great thing? That, imagine like a factory somewhere is about to lay off a bunch of people, and the president calls the CEO and says, you can't do that, right? Well, let's look at the unintended consequences. However, it is very difficult in firing full-time workers that made France a highly lucrative market for US-based Manpower. So Manpower Group is a company that specializes in temporary work, right? So, temp work is what people usually refer to. And so in this particular case, what's fascinating is that this American company, Manpower Group, today, I'll show you the next slide here. Today, this is from their 2019 annual report on page 37. If you look at where money comes from, right? In this case, you have revenue from services and you have operating profit. And you look at the United States at, there we go, $2 billion right here. Other Americas, $1 billion. So there's $4 billion for the Americas. France is at $5.5 billion. There is no other single country that comes close. France is in this particular case, when you look at gross profit, their most profitable market, double that of the U.S. at 284. And by the way, population, last I checked, I think is about 70 million people, as opposed to 330 million people. And so why is it that Manpower is so profitable? Their most profitable market is France. There you go. Unintended consequence is companies, because it is so difficult in France to fire anyone, what French companies are doing is they're relying on part-time workers. And that way they don't have to worry about laws of firing. So there's a lot of people in France that work part-time because of that. Again, it's really important to think about unintended consequences when you think about these, quote unquote, great intentions. Because yes, of course, we want to help the workers. And so institution resource, now we're getting into the one of the last phases of the chapter here, when we look at institution versus resource-based view. So same thing as, when you look at the institution-based views, formal rules governing HRM, or the informal new rules and values are going to affect staffing, training, etc. But so are your resource-based views, right? In terms of your VRIO, again. So let's look at that. In terms of formal institutions, every country has rules, regulations that govern HRM, and foreign companies can choose to ignore them at their own risk. So there's that. Unfortunately, a lot of multinationals have passed on France, and they're going to other Western European countries exclusively because they're worried about unions. And so that's going to affect things. Informal institutions, MNEs from different countries have different norms in staffing. HR managers should avoid stereotyping. And extra compensation should be provided to attract high caliber and senior expats. Looking at the VRIO for each step. And so what we have here on page 215 is, the dimensions looking at HRM becoming more strategic. The first one for value is training adds value to jobs that cannot be outsourced. And so that's the first one. And to make sure that you are, in this case, that activity for training is going toward an area that is valuable for you. And for the industry, right? The rarity, learning, sharing, adopting good practices lessen rarity and usefulness. Imitability, or ideally inimitability, which is, again, the original VRIO. Complex human resources are difficult to imitate. This is where I feel like for that one, for inimitability, I always want to go back to the tacit knowledge. Remember that one? Tacit versus explicit knowledge. We talked about it before. Tacit knowledge is that thing that's extremely difficult to pass on. If there's going to be, I use the example of Toyota Motor Company and how you can, let's say you could take a Toyota factory from, Toyota City, Japan, and just build it somewhere in another country and have everything there. As long as you don't have hands-on training, long-term hands-on training, the quality will never ever match that of the original place. And that would be an example of, in this particular case, that those activities being impossible almost to imitate. The organization, the way that the teamwork and diversity affects organizational pattern. So there's again, the idea for you to be truly competitive as an organization is to answer yes on all of them based on the areas you're going to. And then lastly, for this chapter, the 4 C's. And so here we're looking at the implication for action for you guys, students, and thinking about what that means. And so the 4 C's, the first one is be curious. Know formal and informal rules of the game governing HRM in all regions and operations. Be competent. Develop organizational capabilities that drive business success. Be courageous and caring. As guardians of talent, HR managers need to nurture and develop people. And for the non-HR manager, the 5th C, be proactive in managing your international career. Again, make sure that you take the steps. I always tell you guys, differentiate yourself. Differentiate yourself. You cannot be like everybody else. Make sure that with your degree, with your emphasis, people ask me sometimes even about certificates, whether they really help. Well, they really, really help, especially if your degree is not a business degree and you get a business certificate. It adds validity. Earlier, I talked about LinkedIn. LinkedIn is great at having people add skills, competencies there that help recruiters find that special person that's got what they're looking for. That concludes this chapter. For the key terms, again, same as always. Please make sure you get them out of the way. We've covered all of them. They're all there. And the summary, same thing here. So I hope that you've enjoyed this chapter, and I'll see you guys for the next one.